Thank you very much, Anita, for not just giving us this broad historical picture of a pretty long life, but also building a bridge into the present as we try to do this in this series. And the floor is open for your questions. Yes, please. There are micros here.
Thank you for your nice talk. Ben Gurion, where he spent the end of his years in Sde Boker, such a beautiful part of Israel overlooking the desert. That's where he meditated. He started to do yoga, at the end of his life. And what do you think drove his fascination and his passion for the desert, for planting the seeds of the desert in Israel? And also, how would you describe his fascination with Eastern religion and philosophy? How would you describe that influenced his life and as a political leader? Thank you.
Well, first of all, his fascination with the Negev, I think, stemmed from two sources. First, the Negev was half of the state of Israel, and it was empty, and it needed very much a voluntarist drive, a pioneering drive to settle the Negev. So he went to the Negev, first of all, because he believed, wrongly, unfortunately, that his going there would arouse a movement among Israel's young people that would follow him and cultivate and create new settlements in the Negev. But more than that, the Negev was for him a symbol of progress, of what he looked for in Israel, how science and technology and innovation can make the desert bloom. And this, for him, was part of his ideology and of his state of mind. Every crank who came up to Ben Gurion with an idea of how to desalinate water and how to make the growings in the desert would find an attentive ear of the founding father. But it was very important for him that this part of the country, this vast desert that looked like it just came out from the hands of the Creator, would be turned by modern efforts into a settled country. And this is why he went to the Negev. Now, you had his fascination with Buddhism. I don't know why he was fascinated with Buddhism. He did show a great interest in all kinds of philosophy. For instance, when he met with philosopher Isaiah Berlin in Oxford in 1950, they discussed Plato, of course, and Spinoza, and also the role of elephants in Indian imagery. I don't know to this day why it was important, but the fact was that these two people, these two Jews from Eastern Europe who met in Oxford, had nothing else to talk about but Indian elephants.
I think it shows really well both his way of a more particular state nation in Israel, but also obviously universalism.
Of course.
And this is just a wonderful example of this. We have a lot more questions. There's a micro over there. Yes. Please.
You talked about the status quo agreement that he reached, and his thought that, and you correct me if my numbers are wrong, but I believe the original deal was 100 men would be exempt from military service and would receive a stipend. the number has grown tremendously. And I wonder in his later years, looking back on that and what was happening, whether he had said or wrote anything as to whether that part of the agreement might have been a mistake.
First of all, the question of the yeshiva students to be exempt from military service did not appear in the status quo agreement. It was something that he agreed to voluntarily on his own goodwill, not 100, 400, but there was a cap. And this cap was kept. Dayan raised it to 2,000, but until Begin removed the cap, the numbers did not go beyond that. So this is one remark. Now, Ben-Gurion actually regretted giving this agreement, agreeing to the exemption from military service, even during his prime ministership. But he did not rescind it, which means, okay, I did a mistake, but I cannot go back on it. He did it in the first place because he thought that yeshiva students are part of the Jewish culture, and especially after the Holocaust, he wanted to give an opportunity to revive that culture symbolically, because he believed that it would vanish on its own. What he would have done today, I don't know. I don't know.
Please take the mic.
Excuse me, could you hear me okay? So you mentioned about that there were physical clashes between him and his opponents.
Yes. When he was the general, how do you call it? Secretary General of the Histadrut, yes.
So going back to the War of Independence and his relationship with the Irgun and the bombing of the King David Hotel, did he know about this ahead of time, and what was his reaction, and what could you just sort of set the table for us about what happened in regard to the bombing of the hotel and what his reaction was to that? Thank you.
He had his very strong reservations about the Irgun, about Etzel, very strong reservation, and he initiated the Saison, namely the submission of the Irgun fighters to the British. But the bombing of the King David Hotel was done during the period when there was cooperation between the Irgun and the Haganah and Palmach during the resistance movement against the British. I don't think he knew ahead of time about it, because Ben-Gurion at that time was in Paris, and I'm sure that this was not information that was imparted on the way. But I did not find his comments about it. He after that agreed to stop any actions, any military actions against the British until the Congress in December 46. At that Congress, he convened a small meeting of Haganah activists and told them that we have to stop any activity, any military activity against the British, not to give them any excuse to crash Jewish military forces, because he already envisioned the war against the Arabs, and he said that. At that time, everybody thought this is just excuses. He doesn't mean it seriously. But the fact was that he was right. Yes.
ערב טוב וברוכים הבאים. Dr. Shapira. My name is Adi Paliti. I'm an alumni graduate student from here at American University. I also work with Laura at the center here.
Okay.
Something that's interested me as I've gotten more and more interested in, or more and more involved in Middle East politics, is the interplay between Ben Gurion and Moshe Sharet. Especially a relationship that went from very close, very collegial, to almost competitive, to the point that Ben Gurion essentially eclipsed Sharet politically. Could you discuss a little bit more, talk a little bit more about that relationship, that history between the two of them?
Okay.
Tada.
First of all, there was never a question of Ben Gurion eclipsing Sharet. They were not on the same level. What can I say? Sharet was always a very loyal number 2 or 3, never number 1, except in his own eyes. Now, when Ben Gurion went to Sde Boker in 1953, he did not want Sharet to be appointed prime minister. He thought that he lacks the courage necessary for a prime minister. But the party, Mapai, chose Sharet, and Sharet replaced him as prime minister. A year later, in 1955, Ben Gurion returned to be Minister of Defense under Sharet until the next elections. Now, they differed in policy, not so much in concept. Both did not believe that at that time a peace agreement with the Arab states was possible. But Sharet believed very much in the international arena, in diplomacy, and wanted Israel to win international recognition through moderation, through paying more attention to the world opinion, etc., etc. Ben Gurion, on the other hand, for him the top question was the question of defense. As a result of that, he sanctioned reprisals against Jordan and Egypt after in retaliation to infiltration and the killings of Israeli citizens. Now, Sharet was opposed, not completely, but to the degree of violence in these acts. Well, Ben Gurion said that when you start a military action, you never know how it finishes. So you cannot, ahead of time, tell how many casualties there will be. So the point was, I would say, diplomacy vis-a-vis military actions. And it was true especially to the period between 54 to 56. Now, when Ben Gurion chose to come back to be prime minister, and nobody except Sharet thought that this was not legitimate, Sharet played down. Now, Ben Gurion asked him to stay as a minister of foreign affairs. However, Sharet organized at least 2 times a majority in the government against Ben Gurion's decisions. Now, Ben Gurion felt that most of the public and most of his party followed his own policy, and that Sharet was infringing on this policy. So when he felt that the days were near a crisis with Egypt, which happened after the Egyptians had the agreement with Czechoslovakia about the procurement of military equipment, he asked Charette to step down and appointed instead Golda Meir as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Now, in any other country, this would be accepted as a normal change of minister, legitimate for the prime minister to do. But in small Israel, young Israel, a very familial government, everybody thought that this was done, that Ben-Gurion did a very unfair act against Charette. Since that time, Charette became the hero of the dovish camp in Israel, especially historians. And they portrayed him much more dovish than he really was. So, what can I say?
I'd like to ask the question about Ben-Gurion and the Holocaust. You know, you made only one partial mention of the Holocaust. And I'd like to know if historians are critical, have been critical of Ben-Gurion for his role in the Holocaust, for perhaps not allocating enough resources to taking the people out of Europe. Okay, thanks.
This is a question that I always find so puzzling. The Yishuv in Palestine at that time were 450,000 Jews under British rule. In order to send a telegram, they had to ask the British to allow them, not to mention other things. Now, what kind of resources were at their disposal that they could have taken Jews out of Europe? Please, let's think about it. So Ben-Gurion felt very helpless, extremely helpless. Now, he was a person that did not divulge his feelings in public. He explained it a number of times, that something that hurt him very much, he cannot talk about it in public. But in intimate letters, there is this feeling, terrible feeling of helplessness, of rage, and of not knowing what to do, because there were no means of doing anything. American Jewry, much bigger, did they have the means to take Jews out of Europe? No. So what could have Ben-Gurion done, for God's sake? Where were the ships that he could acquire? Goodness. We are talking about a world war.
Behind you.
Thank you. When you look at the history of the birth of the State of Israel, the institutions created in the Yishuv, the leadership, all aspects of the proto-state created were all creatures of the labor movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so the narrative of the birth of the state was inexorably tied to the labor movement.
Mm-hmm.
When Begin was elected, he represented a political movement that was around during the Yishuv and during the birth of the state, and whose institutions really played at best, a marginal role in the birth of the state. But in the subsequent 35 years, they've dominated the political environment.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, has the narrative of the birth of the State of Israel been lost in Israel itself?
I can tell you one thing. I was very much offended when this last year, the Ministry of Education chose as the subject, the main subject to be taught in schools, leadership, and they chose two leaders, Ben-Gurion and Begin. I found it very, very offensive that Begin would be on the same level with Ben-Gurion, with all due respect to Begin. who signed the peace agreement with Egypt, and this was, to his great credit. Still, there is a difference between the two leaders. So, yes, that is true. Today in Israel, we see an appropriation of history by the other side.
Hello. My question is, if Ben-Gurion revisited his political strategy of engaging with the youth of Israel after the state was
I didn't
created.
hear you.
My question is, if Ben-Gurion revisited his strategy of engaging with the youth like he did during the World Zionist Congress to gain the majority of votes in Poland, and if he did that after the state was founded.
I did not understand the question. Sorry.
Did Ben-Gurion revisit his political strategy of engaging with youth movements once the state was founded?
No. He wanted, Ben-Gurion had a strategy after the establishment of the state that everything that belonged to partial organizations, to particular organization, should be acquired by the state. So education should not be divided into streams, labor and general and religious. Eventually, we had one secular education and one religious education. He also did not allow, of course, different army organization. There is one army, there is one government. He also demanded dismantling of labor, how do you call it? לשכות עבודה. Employment offices, and demanded that the state overtake them so they won't be political. This was against the tradition from the Yishuv times that everything was political. And everything was divided according to political keys. For instance, the Jews in the DP camps called it the Palestinian crank, the Palestinian illness, that everything was according to political keys. So even on the illegal ships, people were located according to their political affiliation. So he did not want to have many youth movements. He wanted to have a state youth movement, like the Boy Scouts or something like that. It did not work out. And he accepted it eventually, that he had to cooperate with various youth movements. Yes.
Okay, Professor Shapira, can you tell a little bit how come that socialist, Marxist man like Ben-Gurion ends up establishing his vision on the prophet Isaiah? So the relationship of the Bible and the importance of the Bible for someone like Ben-Gurion.
Yes.
Someone who wrote a book about
Yes. Well, you see, Ben-Gurion, first of all, his Marxism was very thin, I would say. He knew at the time, at the beginning of the century, that this was the bon ton of the time, this was the fashion of the time, this was the discourse of the time, and he adopted it, but it did not hold for long. He was a socialist. This is interesting. He visited Soviet Russia in 1923, and this is a fascinating story by itself. And there he met with representatives of the Zionist socialist youth movement members. And they asked him, "Are you socialists? No, are you communists?" So he answered, we are communists according to what we understand. Namely, we are not the communists according to the Marxist vision, but according to what we think is equality and striving for the betterment of the people. So for Ben-Gurion, placing the vision on the Bible was natural, I would say, especially after the establishment of the state, when he was looking for a common ground that would speak not only to the Jews, to the veterans in Palestine, but also to the newcomers to the country. Those newcomers did not know the Zionist ideology, they did not know European socialism, but they did know the Bible. And he believed that the Bible could be the glue that would keep the Israeli nation together. That's it.
I have a vague memory from my youth that Ben-Gurion's government fell eventually on the question of who is a Jew.
No.
Could you elaborate a
Yes,
little bit on that
yes,
issue?
yes.
Thank you.
Okay. This is a very good question considering the fact that just a few days ago, the Israeli Court of Higher Justice decided that there is no such thing as a Israeli nation, only a Jewish nation. So the question of who is a Jew did cause to the fall of one of Ben-Gurion's governments, not his last one. It was one in 58, I think. Now, the matter was very simple. How do you define the borders of the Jewish people? How to define the right to belong to the Jewish people? Is the definition subjective, namely according to the wishes of the father and mother, as long as they educate the kids in the Jewish secular tradition, or it is according to the halakha, where it is according to the mother's descent. So during this discussion, it's very interesting. At the beginning, Ben-Gurion was all fire for the possibility that everybody can decide how to educate his children, and nobody is to decide for the parents. The concrete question was whether children of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother can be considered as Jews. Now, because the crisis became stronger and stronger in time, we'll see immediately that he retreated from his position. But before I go there, I want to remind all of us that Ben-Gurion's son, Amos Ben-Gurion, married a lovely non-Jewish girl whom he met when he served in the British Army in the Second World War. She was an Anglican from the Isle of Man, and the anecdote goes like that when, which is of course apocryphal, when Amos Ben-Gurion came to his father and said to him, I met a nice girl and I want to marry her, but she's not from one of us. She's not one of us. No, in Yiddish we say unsere. Now, so Ben-Gurion said, never mind, even if she is a member of HaShomer HaTzair, it's okay. His imagination did not go farther. But let's go to the serious part. But he accepted his daughter-in-law very well, and there was rapport between them. He tried to have her converted by a Reform Jew, but it was not accepted in Israel. And eventually, in the 70s, she and her daughter went through Orthodox conversion, but it took a long time. So Ben-Gurion was very open on these questions, but he understood that from the political point of view and the cultural point of view, this was a very deep matter, and that the people were still not ready at that time for such a change. So how to get out of this dilemma? So he decided to inquire among 50 Jewish learned intellectuals, rabbis, whatever, their opinion on this matter. Who is a Jew? Now, half of them were from the diaspora, half from Israel. He chose very carefully the participants in this plebiscite. And when I checked the list, it was clear to me that the result was known beforehand, because he chose, most of the participants were Orthodox Jews.
But the Orthodox Jews were very angry that he chose others too.
Yes.
Interesting approach.
Yes.
And some of them answered, I am not answering because you should just ask the chief rabbinate.
Yes.
That's why we have a chief rabbinate. Yes.
You spoke of a magnificent decade forged during World War II, which led up to the War for Independence, the establishment and the building of the state. But you also referenced a precursor before the war, an important decision in which he went for the idea of partition, as this would be necessary in the establishment of the state. Could you speak about how that fed into the reactions leading up to that magnificent decade and on into the establishment of the state, his actions and his thinking, how that played out?
I'll just say one thing. I did not include the period before that as part of his magnificent decade, because at that time he was not the main actor. Actually, the main actor at that period was Chaim Weizmann. It was only during the war when Ben-Gurion started to eclipse Weizmann. And one of the problems on which there was a clash between them was exactly the problem, the theme that I talked about. Ben-Gurion believed since 1939 that the alliance between Zionism and Britain was off. Weizmann did not believe it. Weizmann was still confident that the British would change their anti-Zionist policy, maybe after the war, maybe sooner. And on this matter, there was a clash between them because Ben-Gurion moved on to a pro-American orientation, while Weizmann did not believe it. And there is a wonderful letter from Weizmann to one of his associates, and he says, Ben-Gurion is out of his mind. He thinks that after the war, the British Empire is going to fall, and that there are going to be just two big powers in the world, Russia and so on. So at that time, he was still not the main player. And that's why I did not include it in the magnificent decade. I thought you were going to say, why didn't you include the Sinai campaign and so on and so forth? Well, I think that despite everything, the formative years were until he went to Sde Boker in 1952. That's it.
Anita, you couldn't have found a better conclusion, because this is already the transition to our next talk, which will be about a month, a bit more than a month from now, on Chaim Weizmann, delivered by Yehuda Reinhardt, former president of Brandeis University and biographer of Weizmann. So we do hope to see all of you back then, again in the Katzen Art Center. I just want to conclude with another saying attributed to Ben Gurion, which of course many of you probably know, when he said, "Whoever does not believe in miracles is no realist."
Yes.
And I think that is certainly something of lasting importance to the state of Israel, or at the present maybe to some other states as well. You're all invited to a little reception, and of course can have, I know there were more hands up, but you can have maybe more private chat with Professor Shapira, whom I thank again.